Bonjour, bienvenue à ce dernier panel de la grande transition intitulé Planification démocratique, quels usages pour la technologie? Welcome to this last panel of the Great Transition entitled Democratic Planning, what role for technology? Je vais poursuivre l'animation en anglais. La traduction simultanée est disponible. Vous avez qu'à cliquer sur le globe qui apparaît au bas de l'écran pour avoir une traduction simultanée vers le français. I will present our three panelists, and each of them will present, and after all of them, we will have a Q&A session. If you would like to ask questions, please use the Q&A box that is at the bottom of your screen. So let me introduce our panelists today who agree to be with us in this beautiful day in Montreal, at least. So first of all, we have Paul Cockshott. He is a computer scientist and an economist. He teaches at the University of Glasgow. And with Alan Cottrell, he developed a democratic economic planning model where computers play a central role. Ingrid Hanon is a doctoral candidate in philosophy at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Her work focuses on transforming the technological model in a way that promotes emancipation and human creativity. And finally, we have Michal Rozworski. He is an economist and the author of The People's Republic of Walmart, published in 2019, which shows how multinational corporations use the advance in information technology to ensure the central planning of their operation. So I would like to invite Paul to turn on his mic and he can start his presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. I've got material in the form of a presentation, so I intend to try sharing my screen if I can. Can you see that? Good. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to be talking about complexity orders, which is a computer science concept to do with how hard it is to solve a problem. And first look at the historical background to the calculation problem. Immediately after the First World War, the Austrian socialist economist Neurath advocated that an economy should be run in terms of calculation in natura, in natural units, rather than in money. And he said that during the war, it had been evident that in order for society to survive and for a state to survive, it had to plan things in terms of physical units of food and raw materials. And he proposed that this should be a model for a future social society. And he became an economic advisor to, I think, the Bavarian Socialist Republic. The immediate response to that came from other Austrian economists who were more conservative. And von Mises argued that only money provides a rational basis for calculation, and that the only other alternative would have been calculation in terms of labor time, and this would be impractical because it would require you to solve millions of equations. And you got these arguments further developed by Hayek, who said that the market is a telecommunication system and only the market can communicate the information necessary to coordinate an economy. In the late 20s and 1930s, a series of mathematicians came up with practical ways of doing the calculation. Robert Ramack was the first. And he actually proposed that calculations should be done using electromechanical computers or electromechanical calculating machines. He died in Auschwitz. Von Neumann fled Central Europe but came up with similar mathematical models. And obviously, the only person in a position to actually try it out was Leonid Kantorovich, who produced proposals for rationalizing Soviet planning. But the interesting thing about all of these methods of calculation is that they all show that you can do the calculation in natural terms as advocated by Neurath. Neurath didn't say how it was going to be done. Now let's look at the scale of the problem. In the 1950s, the Soviet planning agency, Gosplan, was able to prepare detailed material balances for some 3,000 products, had some control over 30,000 products. By the late 1960s, there were millions of products in the Soviet economy. And this was more than could be handled in detail by a Gosplan staff. Now, people tend to think of the Soviet Union as being very bureaucratized, but in fact, it had a tiny bureaucracy to try and handle this. It had only a few thousand people in Gosplan. You compare that to the number of people who are employed in information processing of one form or another in a Western society, and it's tiny. Just look at the skyline of New York compared to Moscow. How many office blocks are there in Moscow compared to New York? Clearly, far more bureaucratic work was involved running capitalism. Now, suppose you've got 1 million products and each use roughly 200 products for its output. For its input. If you're processing that on a computer, you're going to need 2 numbers for every product use intersection. Use something like a product code and the amount of the input for each product. So 2 words of computer memory, and you need something like 400 million words of memory. Seems tiny nowadays. You can easily achieve that on a cheap computer. But the machines that were available to the Russians right up until the end of the Soviet Union was really pushing their capacity to store that much information. Now, what I'm going to talk about next is a series of pieces of open source software, which I've released in GitHub and SourceForge. And they allow you to use either Kantorovich's approach, the approach we described towards a new socialism, which we call the harmony theory approach, or they use the approach developed by Leontiev, who was another Soviet economist who moved to the United States. I'll have to go through these very fast. First example is Kantorovich's approach. It's easy to use that nowadays because his method of linear programming was also discovered 10 years later in the West by Danzig, and there's lots of standard packages which implement linear programming. The easiest one to make use of is LPsolve, which is available for free. And the starting point for doing any of these planning demonstrations is to use input-output tables, which is what Leontiev invented. Basically, you represent the economy as a square table. Each column represents a type of product, represents an industry, and each row represents the amount of a given product used in that industry. So this says 0.1 of a ton of iron is used to make a ton of iron. 2 tons of coal are used to make a ton of iron, etc. So that's how you interpret them. And you need other information if you're going to plan. You have to know how fast your capital stock depreciates. You have to have another table which says how much capital stock of every kind do you need to make things. And you need to have some targets for what your output in each year is going to be and how much your labor force is going to be. So I'm giving a very simple set of illustrations there. If you've got a set of input-output tables like that, you can relatively easily translate these into a linear program of the type that Kantorovich wanted. But if it's going to work on a national scale, the time taken mustn't be too great. If you have 100 industries, it may work easily, but if you have 1 million industries, it will be too slow. What about the LP solve package, which does the Kantorovich approach? Well, what you find is that the x-axis here is the number of industries, and the y-axis is the time to solve a plan, a 1 year, 2 year, 5 year plan. So it becomes more complex the more years you want to solve it for, and it becomes more complex the more industries you want to solve it for. And the critical thing is if you plot this on a log-log scale, you get that the x term, the graph is proportional to x to the power of 3. So it's an x cubed problem. And that's not, whilst in computer science terms, that's regarded as polynomial and thus tractable. If you've got 1 million industries, it's not. For instance, even for 50,000 industries, if you applied the LP solve process to optimizing a 5-year plan, it would take 2,400 years on the little, it must be said, I was doing this on a $50 computer, but 2,400 years is still a lot. And that $50 computer is faster than the machines Kantorovich had. So you need something that's better than that. And in our book Towards a New Socialism, we proposed a faster way of doing this. And we've released it in Java. And why do we think that there has to be a way of doing it faster? Well, it's a basic principle of computer science that the complexity of an algorithm remains the same irrespective of the type of computing machine you have available to solve it. And they only just differ by a constant factor. Now, if you view all the people doing calculations on pieces of paper and accounting books at the time von Mises was writing, all those accountants and businessmen constituted collectively a computer. And if it were the case that to coordinate 50,000 industries would take, 50,000 products would take 24,000 years. Well, clearly the world capitalist economy, which was producing well over 50,000 products in von Mises' day, wouldn't have been able to survive. So we know that there is a solution which is better than the purely optimal von Neumann solution. Now, what is generally the case with these things is that you have to trade off optimality against speed. And we have no reason to believe that an actual capitalist economy arrives at an optimal solution. Now, the harmony method, we tested this in the 1990s and it had an n log n complexity, which is much better than n squared. And basically, it uses a socialist utility function, which is that you set a plan, and if you fall short of the plan, that's regarded as much worse than having a surplus. You want to avoid falling short, but it's nice to have a bit more. And we did it, this is the way we did it in our book. We have a curve which until you reach the point, if suppose the plan target was 2, if by the time you reach 2, it's sloping upwards quite steeply, but above that it rises more slowly. The point being that it has a diminishing marginal harmony as you rise up, and therefore it penalizes under fulfillment more than it rewards over fulfillment. I'm not going, because of the limited time, I'm going to skip through the actual maths. Because it's a continuous first derivative, you can apply a Newton-Raphson method to approximate the function. And this allows you to rapidly bring all the industries into approximate alignment with the planned target. I'm going to skip over the details of the algorithm here. The important point is it's very, very much less complex and runs an awful lot faster. Here I'm plotting in the upper graphs, this shown by the blue area, that's what the Kantorovich algorithm gives. The green window shows you what the harmony algorithm gives. And the important thing is to look at the factor here, that it's almost a constant factor for log x. So it is roughly linear with the size of the industries, number of industries, which is good. That's what you want. I've released other versions of it other than the Java versions, which are a bit faster. This indicates that instead of taking 2,000 years to solve a plan, we could solve it in about 10 minutes for 50,000 products. And this is on I was deliberately doing all this on the cheapest computer I could buy, which is an Odroid single board computer that uses a mobile phone chip in it for demonstration purposes. You can also combine harmony paramming with Leontief techniques. And for this, I've released a version using the new programming language, Julia, which is an interpretive, sorry, it's a functional language which compiles very efficiently. I'll skip through this. Again, input-output tables. There's a standard thing that Leontief has, which is called the A matrix, which is laid out the same way as an input-output table. And it's normalized by the amount of output so that the numbers are all less than 1. Now, the important equations in Leontief is that you can use this A matrix to do a matrix multiply times the output you want O, and it immediately gives you, by matrix multiplication, the resources you'll require to produce that output. This was a basic result of Leontief's theory of planning. And you can, with the Julia software I've got, you can demonstrate this interactively. But you can also say, obviously, how much will be available for final consumption, because you take the resources required from the total output. So one of the problems that was said about the Soviet planning method, it was only in terms of gross outputs. It wasn't in terms of final consumption. You can invert this by taking the final consumption you want. You take the identity matrix minus A, take the inverse of that and multiply it by the final consumption, and you get the gross output that you're going to have for your plan. Now, that stage of operation didn't tend to be done in the Soviet Union. They discussed doing it, but didn't really have the computing resources to attempt it. So as I say, one of the problems was that they did things in terms of gross outputs. You have to extend this a bit. The standard Leontief method is only within 1 year. You extend it into, instead of using matrices, you extend it into using tensors with a time dimension. When you do that, you give a time dimension to all of them and use the harmony method to solve over time. So it works from demonstration purposes. It seems to work pretty well. I use a slightly different harmony function, but the idea is the same. I'm skipping over this because I'm not, this is partly tutorial material for people who I expected might actually be using the software. One of the problems is that if you're doing planning and you say you want to construct a 5-year plan, you can get an algorithm to say how much capital resources do you require each year in order to have the output we want at the end of the 5-year plan. But the algorithm only looks ahead 5 years. So it thinks, okay, in the last year, we don't have to invest anything. We can afford to allow the capital stock to run down. And that's one of the problems of a limited time horizon. So in practice, if you're suppose you're constructing a 5-year plan for Canada to deal with the environmental crisis and to reduce the carbon dioxide outputs, you would have to actually construct that as, say, 5 years plus however long it was going to take for the stock of goods and materials that you had in year 5 to depreciate to nothing. So you have to say, okay, we're going to do 5 years plus 14 years after that at the same situation. And that will tell you what to do in the first 5 years. That's just a technique. There are various issues about how to get the plan to converge. I'll skip over them. There's a performance issue that if you're using the matrix inverse is in principle of order n to the 3, which was as bad as Kantorovich's approach. But Julia provides a much faster method of doing it, which is, well, you write it as I minus A and use a \f, which the intuition of that backslash is meant to mean it's something like dividing, but that way is very, very much faster. It uses very much faster linear solver algorithms, which are highly optimized. And you find that it runs close to linear time. The thing you next have to look at is how much the interconnection between industries grows as the number of industries in an economy increase. And this is a plot here of the US economy. And as you increase the disaggregation of the economy, as it goes towards more and more industries, once you divide it into 450 sectors, the number of non-zero elements in the A matrix grows by a certain amount each time, and then it levels off. Now, this is a very important point because I'm going to skip over this. In network theory, there's what's known as a small world network. And a lot of networks turn out to be small world networks, and they have a property that the number of non-zeros in the matrix grows very slowly. It grows sublinearly. And this means a planning algorithm, a planning process, can actually not have a sublinear performance. All the tests I used to do, I always assumed n log n performance, which, because there's a theory about random graphs from Erdos that an n log n graph is the lowest fan out that you can reliably expect it to be fully connected. Okay, but in fact, it looks as if economies are much less dense than that, much sparser and much more tractable, which means that economies are likely to be extremely easy to plan compared to these worst case scenarios. There's some very interesting work being done at the moment by a Swedish guy, Hanon, who's doing some tests on this. And he can solve for 10 to the 8 non-zeros in an A matrix in 10,000 seconds, 3 hours on a laptop. So this indicates that you could easily, on a modern multiprocessor, run his laptop, solve real-time planning for an economy of the full complexity of the USSR in a matter of a few hours. Okay, I think I've just about hit my time limit.
Yes, thank you very much. That was fascinating, but also very complicated for people in maybe social science like me. but very, very thoughtful. Thank you. I'm gonna invite now Ingrid.
Hold on, I've got it on.
Yes, thank you. When you are ready, Ingrid, you can start and turn on mic.
I need to share my screen. Can you see the PowerPoint? Yeah, okay. So thank you for inviting me for this presentation. Before starting, I would like to say thank you to the organizer of the event and apologize for my strong accent in English and because I don't have the same level of expertise that my co-panelists. I am just a PhD student, and many of the ideas I will present here are still in an embryonic stage of development. So the topic I will present is a combination between some research I have done on Cuban Revolution and its food and agriculture system, and my current PhD research on the end of work and market labor theory of value. I will use my studies in these two topics to reflect upon the question of the role of technology in both capitalist and post-capitalist societies. So the presentation will first look at the Fetter thesis and how 20th century Marxists and even more contemporary post-capitalist proposals came to think about the supposedly emancipatory role of technology. Then I will underline how this interpretation represents a reductionist approach on Marx thinking regarding the forces of production. Third and fourth, I will reflect upon the question of the role of technology in both capitalist and post-capitalist societies in connection to the dual dimension of the production process of capital, its labor process, and the valorization process. So the concept of the Fetter thesis refers to the idea according to which at certain stage of development, capitalist relations of production become a barrier or a fetter for the further development of the productive forces. From this perspective, the inherent contradiction between relation and forces of production could be overcome through the abolition of private property and market regulation. The transformation of the relation of production will then allow for the further development of the productive forces. This approach is normally attributed to Marx himself because of a number of speculative passages in some of his work, like the preface of a contribution to the critique of political economy, where he refers to the relation of production as becoming a fetter for the further development of the productive forces. But also in the Grand Risa, in the so-called fragment of machine, where he refers to the role of technical progress in the reduction of the working time, or even in volume 1 of Capital, where he states that the monopoly of capital in a context of increased centralization of the means of production and socialization of labor become a fetter for the mode of production that has flourished under it. This uncritical perception of the productive forces as a positive vector of progress dominated much of the 20th century Marxist praise of capitalist technology, the industrial mode of production, and tailored scientific organization of production. Accordingly, the profit-driven technological development of capital could be appropriated as such and serve as the basis for a new society. Similar postulate has emerged within contemporary post-capitalist imaginaries, like those claiming for a full automated and post-scarcity future. The contemporary version of the Fetter thesis either put the question of work emancipation aside of the utopian dreams by promoting self-realization outside the sphere of work, or simply reject work altogether by promoting a world without work. The challenge is no longer to reduce alienation at work and make it a more satisfying activity, for work is perceived as negative by nature, always related to toil and suffering, and therefore incompatible with the communist mode of production. Previous reveries of emancipation, self-realization, and creativity at work are therefore replaced by the idea of work as a symbol of a dystopian world. In this regard, the contemporary post-capitalist cult of technology looks at robotization and automation as promising technologies, able to free humanity from the drudgery of work while increasing at the same time the amount of wealth available for people needs satisfaction. The end of Capital domination become the abolition of work itself. And this could be achieved by the consolidation of a fully automated work. Therefore, instead of critically revising the Fetter thesis and breaking with the ideology of a linear progress, technology turns into a crucial element for workers' emancipation, not from capital, but from work. So following this brief summary of what I call the Fetter thesis, the objective of my presentation is now to provide a critical analysis of this view of technology that, in my understanding, reduced Marx's thought to one-side approach, neglecting his dialectical vision of the productive forces, which incorporates both the progressive but also the destructive character of capital. Second, the Fetter thesis conceives the forces of production as neutral, overlooking the way the technologies of capital shape the kind of wealth to be created, the labor organization, the content of work, and the relation to nature. Third, the Fetter thesis analyzes technologies only from the aspect of material wealth, neglecting Marx's analysis of value production and the valorization process of capital. So regarding the dual character of technology, and this reduction of Marx's thought to one-sided approach, I just wanted to recall that in relation to the Fetter thesis, that if one goes back to Marx works in the Grand Reset of Volume 1 of Capital, we can also find many sections in which, instead of referring to the progressive character or role of technology, Marx emphasizes on the dehumanizing and destructive character of the industrial mode of production. He refers to industrial production as a system that confiscates every atom of freedom and transforms the workers into appendages of the machine. He also criticizes the ongoing process of skilling and the kind of monotonous, repetitive, and fragmented work provided by the industrial production. He even refers in some sections to the physical and psychological impact of industrial production on workers' health, or the way industrial agriculture undermines the two original sources of wealth, labor, and the soil. Like this, one can find many statements in Marx's writing that prove, first, that he cannot be reduced to an anarchical cult of technologies, industrial production, and the machinery system. Second, that Marx's idea of a post-capitalist society was not limited to the collective appropriation of the means of production, but also incorporates the transformation of the nature of labor into a more pleasant and creative activity. So this led us to the second aspect, that is technology and the labor process. So in relation to technology and the labor process, I want to stress that the uncritical appropriation, I want to stress the way this uncritical appropriation of the capitalist technologies, whose design have been shaped by the imperative of capital, will determine in a post-capitalist society the kind of wealth to be created, and this might lead to the reproduction of the same labor organization, content of work, and relation to nature of the system of capital. Moreover, to think that the forces of production can be left untouched and reoriented toward a socialist end means to ignore that many of those technologies are just socially or ecologically unsustainable and can be difficult to adopt by countries from the global south. This is so not only because of the incapacity many of those countries might face to bear the modernization cost, but also because those technologies have some cultural, social, and environmental characteristics that make them difficult to adopt or even contrary to the socialist principle. One clear example of this is the technological package of the Green Revolution, highly dependent on fossil fuels, designed for larger scale and export-oriented crops like soy, rice, corn, and wheat, and that benefits already optimal agroeconomic conditions, disregarding the requirement of a small-scale production and subsistence crops. This without mention the low ecological diversity of industrial agriculture and its narrow genetic base. Also the challenge it poses in terms of climate change, its impact on the human health, and the dependency it generates in the use of chemical inputs. So if we agree with the Fetter thesis, those technologies could be appropriated as they are, but used in a different way by a post-capitalist society. Yet, it is difficult to see how this technological package could become compatible with the full development of human potentialities, nature protection, and social needs satisfaction. Many of those technologies cannot be simply rearranged from fossil fuel toward a new source of energy or large-scale monoculture be developed without massive use of pesticides. And if we think, for example, about the kind of work industrial agriculture can offer, this is necessarily unrewarding, alienated, exhausting, and meaningless. It decreases the rural population feeling of belonging, disconnects the farmer from the land, and dismisses traditional forms of knowledge. So if, for example, we look at the Cuban experience in the agrarian sector following the revolution and its attempt to industrialize the agriculture of the country, all the limitations of the inherited forces of production can be observed. The Cuban revolution was not immune to the belief that technology is governed by objective laws outside human control. Modern agriculture was embraced as a symbol of progress in relation to the peasantry. And the problems arising from industrial agriculture were seen as a matter of poverty caused by the unequal access to technology and lack of capital. Therefore, the forces of production of the capitalist world and its organization of agriculture in a factory manner with labor-saving machinery, chemicals, pesticides, and management techniques for large-scale monoculture were perceived as a neutral and universally applicable technology that could be used for a socialist purpose. Even if the country succeeded in providing better conditions to its rural population, this appropriation of modern technology did not come without contradiction and led to environmental degradation, external dependency, food vulnerability, and workers' alienation. The country could not overcome its monoproducer and export-oriented character and kept relying on international trade to satisfy its need for food. Despite great investment in machinery and chemical inputs, the results were not proportional to the investment made and brought with them low productivity and along with problem of labor shortage. The Cuban Revolution provides a very illustrative example of a technological configuration calling to be superseded in the building of a socialist society. A socialist revolution might make use of capitalist technologies, but their design might not be adequate for socialist needs. Even if the ownership system is transformed and a better distribution of wealth is implemented, the appropriation of the forces of production of capital might lead to the reproduction of the same structure of labor along with the generation of the same form of wealth shaped by the exchange value dimension of labor, disregarding social needs to be fulfilled and workers' aspirations. Moreover, the reproduction of the same mode of production of capital in a context where the market coercive mechanism and the reserve army having abolished might lead to problem of labor shortage and declining productivity. If we think about this problem, either some kind of political coercive mechanism needs to be implemented, or the nature of labor needs to be transformed to make it a more creative, rewarding, and attractive activity. For the last option to happen, the forces of production also need to be transformed. And this led me to the last point, and it's in relation to the force of production. And it's the need to analyze technologies and the Fetter thesis, not only in terms of labor process and use value production, but also in relation to Marx's analysis of the valorization process of capital and the dynamic between living and death labor. Such analysis might offer a different perspective of the role of technologies, the Fetter thesis, and the building of a post-capitalist world. Analyzed from the perspective of value, the contradiction between relation and forces of production can be related to Marx's analysis of the organic composition of capital, where he observed that capital's tendency to increase the social productivity of labor leads at the same time to the fall of the rate of profit. Therefore, capital contradiction refers to this logic where the rate of profit falls, not because capital is less productive, but the opposite. This leads us to a second aspect regarding the valorization process. If, for example, we analyze a post-capitalist proposal of a full automated future from the perspective of Marx's theory of values, automation and the increase of that labor in the organic composition of capital might entail implementation within the capitalist system of different counter tendencies to the falling rate of profit. Like, for example, the super exploitation of nature and the working class, mainly in the global south, to counterbalance the tendency of the rate of profit to fall in the global north. This can be related to what some scholars call the third form of surplus value. This consists in repressing wages and can be achieved by outsourcing production to countries in the global south, where the commodity labor power can be paid below its value. This third form of surplus value might provide a different approach to the development of new technologies under the capitalist system, generally related to the extraction of relative surplus value and the replacement of living labor by dead labor with labor-saving machinery. In the case of this third form of surplus value, new technologies might be designed not to replace living labor by automation, but to exploit labor somewhere else, increasing thus surplus value not by reducing necessary labor time, but paying labor below its value. Like, for example, with the case of information and communication technologies. This leads us to the last reflection concerning value and a post-capitalist future. From the standpoint of value theory, it can be said that the Fetter thesis might refer to value as form of wealth, promoting the development of some kind of technologies that are profitable for capital, while preventing the development of other technological arrangements that might have a greater social or environmental impact. If we look at it this way, many technologies that cannot unfold or further develop under the present system because they are contrary to the logic of capital accumulation of value might be unfettered or unblocked in a post-capitalist world based on material production instead of value. To conclude, I would like to stress the need to combine the critique of the forces of production of capital and the material aspect with a critique of value as form of wealth. The critique of the technological system of capital cannot be focused only on the industrial mode of production, for it also needs to involve the critique of the category of value. Indeed, if the politics of technology for a post-capitalist world does not address the question of value as a measure of wealth, the risk is that the productivist and destructive logic of capital will be maintained. Thank you, merci.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. Now, Michal, you can open your mic and I'll let you take the floor.
Oh, thank you very much. I'll also try to share my screen, try to find the window that I want to share. There it is. Let me see. Okay, can people see that all right? Good. This is a low-tech PowerPoint. Nothing fancy here, I think, fittingly. So I think I'm going to try to get at this at a bit of a sort of more general level and just counter Simon's questions for us for this panel with just more and more questions, because I still don't quite have a handle on all of this, despite the fact that published a book a couple years ago that some on the left have definitely taken as a sort of celebration and defense of digital technologies developed under contemporary capitalism, if only they were used, put to better use under a future socialism. But I'm definitely here to say that, the People's Republic of Walmart is a cheeky hook of a title and should not be mistaken for Walmart, but socialist. And I don't want to really spend too much time talking about that or advocating it today. I think, since writing the book and having some really excellent debates, I think it's really opened a series of questions and puzzles that I think are still, at least for me, definitely unanswered, and very similar to the ones, I think, excellent sort of questions that Simone posed for us for this panel. I think that this, this narrower question of what role technology plays in democratic planning gets at some of the real central socialist concerns, or concerns in socialist thinking about planning. So I want to lay out just a few sort of speculative thoughts of how I've been trying to think through this on three sort of specific concerns. So I want to talk about question of neutrality. I think Ingrid really, going to run over some of the same materials Ingrid there probably. The question of knowledge and the question of coordination. I think that, especially this question of neutrality returns in new forms to Hans socialists talking about technology. And, essentially that question of whether technology developed under capitalism can be imported relatively wholesale into a future non-capitalist economic system. So can technology born out of the profit motive, out of the defense of private property, and the desire to squeeze more value out of human labor be adopted into a system instead based on cooperation, on common property, on human flourishing? Is technology neutral with respect to socioeconomic system? I mean, if we are going to be historical materialists about it, I think we should be. Then all technology is social in that it arises in concrete social and historical circumstances. So in a sense, the question is solved. Technology is not something that humans find ready to hand out in the world. It's always developed as part of the social process. But I think there's more interesting things to say about that, right? So I mean, the fact that the ancient Romans had a simple prototype, this well-known fact that the ancient Romans had this simple prototype steam machine, but they saw it as little more than a party trick, a marvel to be sure, but nothing of practical use. The same principles of physics applied in the late 18th century produced something far more than a party trick. But by then, physics itself was something very different than it had been for the Romans. So scientific discovery was now intimately bound up with capitalist accumulation. So it's not just about, using the same thing being put to a different use, but the way we understand the world being very different in many ways. And I think there's a good case to be made that, again, that the Luddites, who were operating not too long after that picture on the right, were some of the first to see this clearly. I think it's standard and sort of stereotypical by now to say that, the Luddites were not against technology itself, sort of blah, blah, blah. But I think, they were, in a way, they were upholding one side of this argument in the debate over whether technology is neutral already in the early 19th century. Rather than thinking about repurposing technology in a new social system, they were concerned with maintaining an existing sort of social relationship of production. For them, the stocking frame and other devices, coming into being at that and being mass introduced in that time, and standardizing the production of textiles were not neutral, but implicated in a reorganization of work. Technology was not neutral specifically, and I think Ingrid touched on this, specifically because of what it did to the work process. And I think that same debate over technology and labor process had perhaps its most important and most sort of consequential episode on the left in the early Soviet Union, when the Bolsheviks debated whether to import Taylorism into Soviet factories. Another sort of well-known episode that I don't want to recount, but it's just helpful, I think, to see it recurring over and over, and helpful to think through the sort of parallels with today's, and I think, much more theoretical rather than practical debate over algorithmic management and digital Taylorism, and to see how those get at the question of neutrality, and especially because I think of, and as Paul's presentation showed, the importance of information, specifically information and communication technologies, to the question of planning. So are today's algorithms sort of neutral tools being used badly? And the algorithm itself is just a procedure for computation. So, as Paul sort of showed, a relationship between information inputs and outputs a fundamental sort of piece of, or a relatively fundamental piece of mathematics. But I think it opens up, much bigger sort of questions, more sort of maybe philosophical. What are the outputs and how do we choose them? What are the inputs and how do we choose those? And what is the process of getting from one to the other? And a lot of that is sort of is elided in the pure sort of mathematical problem. I think there's good questions to be asked about the neutrality of particular algorithms under capitalism, and a growing literature does just this, finding specific algorithms far from neutral, with never mind what they do to the work process, also built-in biases in terms of race or gender in particular. And I think, in a way, this sort of more narrow sense of just biases straight built into things just illustrates how technology is not neutral in this broader sense, not just with respect to individuals within a particular social system, but between systems themselves. Technology is all about making, techne, right? But it's not just about making things. It is just as much, I think, about making people. And capitalism has used technology to remake subjects fit to labor and consume in the aim of production for profit. And the biases in the algorithms sort of recreate hierarchies in society just as much as sort of algorithmic management recreates and reinforces hierarchies at work. So something much sort of bigger going on, and again, add bigger questions. Warehouse, call center, or delivery workers under some of the most intense regimes of algorithmic management describe their work as despotic, both in terms of pace or quantity. So the kinds of things that we've heard about, the speed up so intense that, whether it's UPS drivers or Amazon warehouse workers, they're pissing in bottles and doing other things that are just, a direct outcome of sort of insane speed up. But also in terms of quality, you see interview after interview and surveys with workers frequently showing them talking about being part of a machine, being deprived of autonomy and control. So the problem for socialists is not just the slowdown of work, but the quality of work itself. The labor process itself is a key point of interaction with technology, of course. This includes domestic and household labor. Any real human labor now is done, obviously, with technology, and there's no way of getting out of it. But it's also the place where we see that technology is not neutral, and we can maybe imagine a clean energy capitalism, and we may even see one soon. I don't think that there's a decided question there whether that's impossible. But it's much harder to imagine a capitalism, or I would say impossible, where the work process is left in the hands of workers. So if we do think that technology isn't neutral and opens up all of these things, the hard question is what would be useful and appropriate for a socialist society. So what criteria would future socialists use to determine what should be discarded and what should be transformed? And these are not simple. There's no clear divide, I think, between technologies that should be kept and thrown away. It's not that we're going to be tossing things into one or two baskets. There's maybe some simple cases. I think you can make a pretty clear case for nuclear weapons. But what do we do about the warehouse scanner, which has increased productivity greatly and facilitates a whole sort of regime of the distribution of products? What do we do about the call center app? I'm sure there's already existing or future digital sort of nursing management devices that optimize care work. I think these are hard questions about technology that I don't think we yet have answers to. Capitalism has one fundamental metric of efficiency, and that's the ability to produce profit. Profit is that metric, and it then determines all the other sort of metrics of efficiency, like technical efficiency that transforms inputs into outputs. That efficiency is valuable to the extent that the outputs themselves produce profit, and it's the metric that that makes the most profitable things that ends up being the one that's best under capitalism. But I think technology in a planned economy should be subject to obviously a much greater range of criteria, and criteria that I think, as both Fikret and Pat in the earlier sessions talked about, criteria that may be sort of fundamentally incommensurable. And then the question becomes, how do you decide not only what they are, but between them? And can technology help? Oh, I missed the slide. Sorry about that. There we go. There's 3 debates there. And I think this gets us to the question of knowledge, of, these kinds of deciding between things, I'm going to take a look at time of incommensurable, potentially incommensurable things. So in our book, we described how price under capitalism is a kind of information compression device, at least in theory. Paul talked about this. Of course, it takes everything in the world, distills it down to this one metric that capitalist enterprises care about, which is monetary value, which is itself the measure of profit, and that's fundamentally the metric that's important, and it's under capitalism the criteria are simple, or at least simplified, and any other outcome has to be expressed in those terms. So climate action, for example, has to be a function of price and profit too, if it's to be realized. Externalities are external precisely because they escape price, and if they are going to be something that capitalism takes into account, they have to be brought into price. So pricing is this basic sort of technology of capitalism, and I think this is in a way, other than bracketing Nora to a certain extent, it was on these terms that the socialist calculation debate proceeded for most of its duration. So in the 20s and especially in the 30s, the debate between Lange and Hayek and Mises accepted many assumptions from mainstream economics, in particular that price or shadow price was the measure of efficiency, and thus the criterion for allocating goods and services. And this is sort of this calculation with neoclassical characteristics. And actually Lange quite easily, I think, dispatched Mises in this debate. But the biggest trick that the Austrians then pulled was to reframe the calculation debate as a debate about tacit knowledge. They had lost the calculation debate proper, but ended up winning a debate on their own terms. And I think this is actually why the neoclassical economists of the mid-20th century were able to simultaneously acknowledge that Lange had won the debate, but ignore this fact. The calculation debate exposed two uncomfortable truths about their own theoretical commitments. First, that armed with sufficient computation resources, the Walrasian auctioneer turned planner could actually solve the allocation problem better than markets, just as sort of Lange had showed. That was one of the uncomfortable truths for neoclassical economists. But the second uncomfortable truth, was that their formalization of economic life assumed basically an untenable view of human rationality and knowledge, and that's what Hayek had demonstrated. And there had been rumblings of that, of course, earlier. So Hayek allowed the neoclassicals to ignore Lange, but that they were now ignoring Lange allowed them to sort of ignore Hayek in turn. And I think it was only in the 1970s, with the economics information, that neoclassical economics, neoclassical microeconomics specifically, started to sort of truly respond to the Austrian critique from within the mainstream. And economists have invented ever more refined technologies, auctions, algorithms, mechanisms for exposing, and this is the famous FCC sort of spectrum auctions, for exposing tacit knowledge and integrating it into price. So mechanism design, auction design are sort of forms of planning under capitalism and a sort of technocratic descendant of the calculation debates. And I think especially Murawski and Nick Kahn have argued this particularly well. What am I getting at here? What all of this inherits, all these forms of sort of planning, of market design, of mechanism, what they all inherit is a view of knowledge as something individual and always already available to be uncovered. So the problem with these technologies of planning is threefold. One, they are fundamentally about constructing markets once information has been integrated into price. These are capitalist sort of forms of planning. They sidestep the question of ends or criteria, and they are individualist to the core. I think, in many ways, they sidestep all the questions that socialist planning has to answer. And I think the question of knowledge is central to the question of how we think about planning technologies. What kind of technology treats knowledge as something that's collective and evolving rather than individual and available? as the outcome of deliberation and democracy, rather than something individually possessed, just sort of, waiting to be sort of expressed or uncovered. And is there a way to compare the radical incommensurability of things with reference to more than just price or shadow price? I think that's the question for me left hanging after the, decades after the calculation debates. So ultimately, this question of technology in relation to democratic planning for me is about really coordination more than calculation. And that's this final sort of question. I don't pretend to have Paul's mathematical chops, but I basically agree. I think Pat, this might be something where Paul and Pat Devine agree, is that the calculation problem, is sort of solved in the narrowest sense, or it's at least solved in a way that's sort of, good enough, where you sort of had the approximations in Paul's presentation. And I mean, that's visible too, if Amazon or any other major firm can run its logistics network to the degree of brutal efficiency and exactitude that it does. I think that, again, more evidence that the problem is no longer calculation in that narrow sense of inputs and outputs, but the question of how we should think about what the inputs and outputs should actually be. And I think the calculation debate gives way to a coordination debate. So what do the institutions and technologies in this broader sense look like that could govern production and distribution in a socialist society? And if technology isn't neutral, it's not a case of just reprogramming the big computer to say, better working conditions, maybe a bit less output per hour, or output per unit of labor. What are the criteria that democratic planning would want to consider, and what kinds of technologies and institutions would actually enable society to expand democracy into the economic sphere? I mean, I think these are hard questions. To me, sometimes they seem hopelessly abstract. But so I want to get back into sort of the real world, and sort of close with a couple of small thoughts coming out of an example that Sam Ginden gave in a sort of debate on our book, and it's a future problem that I'm sure we'd all love to have. So imagine we have some form of democratic planning and worker self-management, and there's a bicycle factory where the workers have voted that they want to make bicycles out of titanium or some other sort of rare metal, because this is what will make the best bicycle, the perfect bicycle, lighter, stronger, all of that. And for the bicycle fanatics who work at the bicycle factory, this is great. The question then is, does society give the titanium to the factory to make bicycles? Or does it leave it for replacement hips, machines to make agriculture, whatever other uses this might have? Titanium might be a good. I don't know if the things are still made of titanium, but the things used in medicine or other potentially what many people would see as less frivolous uses than, say, a bicycle. Do we increase titanium mining? The question, on what grounds? And by whom are such decisions made? And this is something that happens, well outside any sort of algorithm, because you have all of these potential questions. What does about distribution, about resource extraction, about all these things that are not fixed. And I think technology figures into these questions in a couple different ways. So there's the technologies of production and the inheritance from capitalism. So bicycle making seems to be the kind of thing that you can pretty directly maybe transplant to a certain extent, and in fact greatly expand, hopefully under socialism, maybe electric bikes rather than so they're more for everyone. But even the choice of production materials and methods is actually quite difficult once more people are involved in decision making. And there are various kinds of efficiency, various kinds of relationships between inputs and outputs that need to coalesce into a social plan. And thinking what makes the best bicycle in isolation in a way to find the limits, is helpful in trying to find what the limits are actually of of worker control over the production process, or maybe not the limits, but the limits of where decision-making lies and who has to be involved in decisions. And you can see how the tentacles of sort of coordination problems have to be spread throughout all of social activity. And again, this gets to the fact the question of coordination is really the question of democracy, or the interaction of levels of democracy at different levels of social production consumption. It's both the source and the solution to the problem of incommensurable criteria. And I think this gets back to the start of the calculation debates. And I think in a sense, Neurath's challenge was sidestepped a bit, and remains in a way unanswered today. Can planning basically be done without prices and without shadow prices? Paul gives a sort of answer, but I think there's other sort of deeper questions underlying it that also need to be answered, and we get to the real hard questions of planning there. Can incommensurability be incorporated into democratic planning apparatus without a total reduction? It's kind of Aristotelian question that was central to Marx as well. Do I have 1 or 2 more minutes? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, just to conclude, please.
Yeah. Regardless of that, I'll skip. Do I have anything else? I think there we go. There's the problem of coordination. There we have, I think one of those is from Peterborough, from somewhere in Ontario, and then one is from Kerala, and the sort of planning process that they underwent a couple decades ago. All technologies in a way a means of boosting efficiency of one kind or another. And debates over Taylorism were focused on how socialists should approach the application of technology to boosting the efficiency of labor. I think the climate crisis demands that we think about efficiency of materials and efficiency and energy usage in ways different than we did in the 20th century. Technology, in the narrow and much broader sense, is fundamental to the socialist project as a project of liberation. About this project of liberation from the sphere of necessity and expansion into the sphere of freedom. But technological development under capitalism or even previous socialist systems has created new spheres of necessity and new means of control to be overcome. And that means we cannot just simply count on a simple liberation of technology, but it's reimagining in a more democratic age. I think I'll end on the note of saying that, we've been accused of being sort of Promethean based on this book. And I think that term gets tossed around a lot, thinking about this sort of, fully automated communisms and all of that. And I think in a way, what I'm saying now undermines a lot of that, or at least I hope it does. Technology is not a neutral inheritance, and the problems of planning go far beyond the question of how inputs relate to outputs. But maybe in a different sense, we have to be sort of really hopelessly Promethean in thinking that we can, remake ourselves rather than just the world when we're thinking about planning, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Michal. All right, so if you'd like, I would invite our panelists to make comments or react about the other presentation that they heard, and if they have any small discussion comments, and then I will open the floor to Q&A questions that I have. So maybe we'll start with Paul. I don't know if you would like to add something to comment on other presentation. And Michal, can you turn off your mic, please?
Can you hear me? Yeah, sorry. There are some things. Capitalist calculation is based on price. And insofar as the worker's time enters into that, it is not labor that is being measured, but labor power that's being measured. And therefore, it can appear to be profitable to, as Ingrid says, depress the price of labor power below its value. And it therefore can actually mean a technological regression. If cheap labor power becomes available, it makes sense for the capitalists to use labor wasting techniques, more primitive techniques of production, because they have cheap labor available. So there isn't a question of reducing incommensurables to something commensurable. That's got to come at a practical level, even though within a planning algorithm, you don't need to have shadow prices. If you have Kantorowicz's algorithm, yes, you do have shadow prices because you follow along the edge of a convex hull. But if you use interior point techniques, no, you don't have shadow prices. That doesn't mean that at a given workplace, like your bicycle factory, that you don't need some indicator. The bicycle workers need to know how much human labor goes into making titanium compared to aluminium if they're going to make rational decisions. That's not the same thing as saying it's price, but you have to know how much other people are going to have to work to achieve what you want to do, so that you don't get away from having to record what the objective labor required for things is. It's not exchange value, but it's the substance behind value that still has got to remain there. That's a trans-historical requirement. Okay.
Thank you. Ingrid, would you like to say something before Michal? Or no, you're fine. All right. Michal, would you like to comment?
Yeah, no, I mean, I found both the presentations really, really interesting. I mean, to quickly respond to Paul, I mean, I think I agree with that, but I still think there's one, like you said, there's simpler and hard, whether you're using sort of material balance on the interior points, or whether you're just reducing everything to sort of labor power or whatever it is. There's a question. I mean, even within that framework, there's still sort of questions of choice of technique and things like that will change, what application of labor power, whatever it is, and that is just one metric of what is necessary in order to, whether it's energy usage or whatever in a more general way also figures into it. So I think there's big questions where, and I think for me it comes down to an institutional question. You have at some point an algorithm that can handle all of these things, but the question of what's going into it and what's coming out, and how far you're willing to go, how far you're willing to democratize decision-making over choice of technique and things like that, and who gets to say on that, I think it's still big. And it's, in many respects, that's one of the big questions, I think, in any kind of planned economy where you're trying to, well, I mean, in a socialist planned economy where you don't just have a single metric that you're aiming at.
Thank you. All right. Maybe I will take a few questions from the chat. So a first one is for Paul. Do you think it will be possible to build upon your work on economic planning calculation to integrate the material aspect of the economic process brought by the social metabolism approach, meaning material and energy stocks and flux? All right. I have a question also for Miao. If you know what is the Jevons paradox, can you talk a little bit about it, or what do you think about it? And maybe this question could also be addressed to Ingrid, right? What or how do we think technological development under a post-capitalist economy within the limit of, you know, the earth and the planet, and to decrease actually our necessity to use a lot of resources, right? Who would like to go first?
I can answer the thing on the material inputs. Yes, in principle, there is no problem with using the Kantorovich approach to dealing with these problems, because essentially you can add as many constraints as you want to a Kantorovich style model. Including constraints. For instance, you mustn't use more than a certain amount of land area that's going to be flooded. You mustn't emit more than a certain amount of carbon dioxide. You mustn't allow more than a certain area of land to be deforested. You can build all those into a Kantorovich model. Now, I said that there are the complexity issues to do with the speed of a Kantorovich model, but the other approaches, not including Leontiev, but the harmony approach also enables you to solve using that kind of approach. If you are wanting to practically construct, I mean, this is a very real problem. How are you going to achieve the degree of fixed capital investment that's going to be required to replace the entire fossil fuel economy structure within the next 15 to 20 years? That's a level of capital investment that hasn't been seen since the Soviet 5-year plans. And it really requires huge amounts of labor and a huge diversion of efforts. And it is related to changes in technique, because it involves techniques which have differential use of fossil fuel. And therefore, you have to form an optimization across the whole economy, which is the best way to get out of the mess we're in. So yes, you certainly can use Kantorovich's techniques and ones which have gone beyond that to address these problems. Now, this has an effect on the labor values of things. If we decide we're not going to use fossil fuel anymore, but we're dependent on other forms of energy, then the amount of labor that's required to achieve something is going to change radically. For instance, the amount of labor required to fly someone across the Atlantic is going to go up a great deal, because you're going to have to fuel the plane by hydrogen, and you have to generate the hydrogen from non-fossil fuel sources. And that, if you're going to fill a plane with hydrogen, fuel a plane with hydrogen, you have to fill half the cabin with a hydrogen tank. So you take half as many people, and you use about 3 times as much energy to do it. So the actual labor value of shifting people across the world that way is going to change. If you don't have diesel ships, the whole transport network of the world, which is based on low cost shipping of things from Asia to Europe and America, isn't going to be viable, because it's outputting is using fossil fuels and outputting a lot of carbon dioxide. So these are really radical changes in technique we're going to have. And you have to follow through the implications of them to every branch of the economy. And how is the labor force going to be changed? You're not going to be able to maintain anything like the current material standard of living without a much larger share of the labor force being engaged in material production now, because the shift we're going through amounts to a big decline in the overall productivity of labor. the idea that productivity of labor is going up and up and up isn't true. It's going to go down for a while.
Thank you. Ingrid, would you like to answer this question about Jevons paradox or technological MD growth?
I don't really know about this paradigm. I just can, maybe the only thing that I can say, like in relation to what I was saying about this value at the two Fetter, no? And when I am thinking about we need to criticize, the technology of capital, I think we also need to recognize that other alternative form of technology, and it's not that it doesn't exist. And when we think, for example, of Latin America and the agroecological movement, for example, what the landless movement is doing in Brazil, they're developing alternative way of not producing food, for example. So my idea, like it exists counter-hegemonic practice and counter-hegemonic, alternative technology, form of innovation coming from below, from grassroots organization. But the point is that they cannot further develop under this system. But there is alternative. So maybe it's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you. Michal?
Yeah, it's a good question about Jevons paradox. I mean, generally the idea is that as the efficiency of something goes up, the use actually also goes up at the same time. So, famous example like energy efficiency. If you increase energy efficiency, you might actually end up using more energy despite having whatever more energy efficient fridges and appliances and things. And I would hope. Well, it's not so much I would hope. I mean, I think this also boils down to the point about price. Is that once you're putting every other form of efficiency in terms of price, it's actually not that surprising that you would get this result with everything else kind of remaining relatively equal. I mean, some people have postulated it's because of like income effect. There's a direct kind of effect that the thing just kind of gets cheaper, so you might end up using more of it, especially depending on like how substitutable it is for other things, and even just the pure sort of like income effects too. Like you're spending less on energy, so screw it, use more, whatever it is, right? So I think I think I would hope, but I think in some ways it is a kind of and fittingly because it is Jevons, hopefully a capitalist paradox that a less reductive sort of that is socialist planned economy could obviously get around in like more just in a more regulated way, but also one that really boils down to in many respects this fact that everything is brought under this every other kind of efficiency actually ends up being about price efficiency ultimately, or profitability or whatever. So I think once you get away from that, you're able to resolve paradoxes like this in a much more sort of direct manner, because you can operate on, ideally you can actually operate directly on these other quantities that you're these other things that you're interested in, energy use, resource use, whatever it is.
Yeah. Smo, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I had a question. When I read Paul's book from 1993, I was really impressed by the demonstration that we can solve the calculus problem, but you can solve the calculus problem when you know what you want to calculate. And that's another problem, and I would like to hear you all on this question of how can technology help us in the determination of what we want to do? Because this is also a complex question of reaching a goal, a common goal, saying, now we collectively want the economy to produce that kind of product instead of this one, and it can seem quite easy to do, and at some time in some models of democratic planning, we have the impression, we are under the impression that, oh, we just have to say what we want to do and then we'll do it. But just even considering what we want to do is something quite complicated for an economy, for for as large an economy as our economy in Canada, for example. So what can technology do or cannot do to help us decide collectively what is the economy and the production will look like?
Thoughtful question. Michal, would you like to? Oh, Paul, go ahead.
Oh, I think
the answers we gave back in 1993, I think I would still think are basically sound. There's two types of topics you have to address. One of them is things which are going to be provided free to people, like free medical care, if you have presumably free education, etc. And there are, in addition, there are overall societal decisions like how much do you want to invest of society's time in preserving the environment? Big, major questions. Now, those kinds of things have got to be presented in a way which are comprehensible to the general public. And I think the way to present them comprehensively is how many hours a week are you willing to work for this? How many hours a week are you willing to be taxed in labor hours to provide education, to provide healthcare? And you can, these are things that modern technology does allow you to directly vote on. We, at Glasgow University, we released a demonstration system called Handy Vote, which enables you to vote using mobile phones on topics like that, allowing you to vote on multiple possible alternatives for increasing, health expenditure, increasing education expenditure, or reducing it, etc., and changes to the amount of tax you'd be willing to pay, and comes up with a social compromise. And this you could have annual votes that everyone in the country can vote on this by mobile phone, instead of having it essentially decided by one person. I don't know how it works in Canada, but in Britain, the Chancellor of the Exchequer decides all this individually. Presumably your finance minister decides that individually. So those are the big questions. The smaller questions of what mix of consumer goods you're going to have, I think, have to be based on a feedback mechanism of what is being bought, and making sure the stock control system feeds through orders in much the way that Amazon or Walmart do at the moment. I mean, that you can't get away from that kind of feedback mechanism, or you'll end up with all sorts of shortages and overproduction of things.
Thank you. Maybe a last intervention from Ingrid and Michal, and then we will conclude this this panel.
I can very briefly just, I mean, I think I agree with Paul on the second part. I think it's right. I mean, I think that's where the sort of modern technology, like that's where you can sort of take technologies a bit more wholesale. I think you get this sort of feedback, exactly those kind of feedback mechanisms of it. Amazon or Walmart, these kind of dynamic systems that actually like aggregate preferences for kind of simpler things. But I think I think this is what I tried to get across in my presentation. I think ultimately those are really hard questions that I don't know if we have a great answer to. I don't think, I think you want to extend some kind of really meaningful democracy to the economic system, which I think gets past just sort of voting on your mobile phone, and you want to have people make decisions in common, and you want to have obviously some kind of representational systems, because otherwise it just becomes totally unwieldy, and you get to Oscar Wilde's problem of endless meetings. But I think even the question, as a lot of people, like for example in Pat Devine's system or whatever, even figuring out like who is affected by which decision and the extent to which they are that it actually merits them having a say in it is not a trivial question. Like that's actually a super hard question. And what these communities are, where the boundaries lie, what kind of impact on decision making they should have. I mean, I think the real sort of like technologies that we really should be concerned with a lot more is kind of like social institutions, like thinking of like Ostrom or others, like actual like institutions as technologies, institutions of decision making, which I think goes far beyond, like an Amazon system for determining if there's enough shampoo or whatever it is. Which that, not to belittle it, but it's that's sure it's difficult, but I think the real hard questions are the harder ones, and I don't think we have a great. I think there's lots of good proposals, but I think it's something that needs to just be thought through a lot more, and it's not it's not as much a technological problem as an institutional problem.
Thank you. Ingrid, would you like to say concluding remarks? Are you fine?
Yeah, I don't really know how to frame it, but my question with this topic of technology and planning, I think that it's not just about what we want to produce, like how we will make people do this kind of work, because we can, like, when I am thinking just a very concrete example of Cuba, they could have they had, for example, this planning, for example, of the 7 million sugarcane harvest, but it's okay, it was a great plan, but then nobody wanted to go and do this kind of work, So that's why my thinking about technology is not really related to planning as such, but it's how we transform technology to change the nature of work. Because even when we plan, whatever we plan, we will need people to, to have some attraction for this kind of work, to feel that, the feeling of self-realization, etc. If not, they will not do this kind of work. And I know in the case of Cuba, for example, when they were producing sugar cane, they had this problem of a labor shortage. Nobody wanted to go and work, in the sugar cane harvest. But for example, since the 1990s, after the end of the Soviet Union, they started to develop now urban agriculture, agroecology, permaculture, and they are thinking about, so what they are saying in Cuba, all the agroecological movement, is like, for example, all this question of technology is not between capital intensive or labor intensive, but a knowledge intensive mode of production, So something that promotes also creativity, our thinking. So yeah, this is where can I relate my thinking about technology. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's the end of this panel. Thank you very much. Stimulating discussion and so much to do and so much to know. I would like to thank you all for being here in this panel, but also in the Great Transition. It has been a wonderful weekend, an amazing team put this event together, and I just want to thank everybody who worked so hard to make things happen. And thank you to all of our translators who maybe are very tired. So, merci beaucoup et au plaisir de vous revoir à Montréal dans une prochaine édition de la Grande Transition.
Prochaine.